Honors students, we're going to be going through Concept 1 notes, and these are super long, so I'm going to go ahead and warn you, this is a long video. So just know in class, we're going to be splitting this up over multiple days, honestly over a full week. So just take your time and pause when you need. But this is the principles of natural selection. So we're going to go through all of like the introductory basics about evolution that you need to know. So first, evolution, we need to know what it is because that's what this whole unit is about. It is the process of biological change that makes descendants differ from their ancestors. And there's two main types. Microevolution, which is evolution on a small scale affecting only a single population of organisms. Microevolution is something we could observe in our lifetime looking at a population of bacteria. Macroevolution is evolution on a large scale, so looking at like an entire species, multiple populations of that species changing over time. This is a lot harder for us to observe in our lifetime because it takes such significant amounts of time. Notice that evolution is about change and it's about relationships. We're not talking about the origin of life in this, we're just talking about change and relationships between different species. So I hope you can see that as we go. I do want to go through with y'all in detail. One of the things that's going to be really different between you and the CP class is the background of what was believed before Darwin, as well as the math that supports all this stuff we're going to learn. So first was Aristotle, and he said that organisms were perfectly formed and already adapted to the world. So all organisms are fixed and unchanging, which aligns with most biblical beliefs as well. Carolus Linnaeus, he saw the adaptations as evidence that a creator had designed each species for a specific purpose. So he said that, cacti have these adaptations to store water because the creator of the universe has designed this species for this purpose of living in this environment. He also is a founder of something called taxonomy, which we'll talk more about in Concept 4, which is just the biology of classifying organisms. And he came up with something called binomial nomenclature, which is a scientific naming system that names organisms by two names, their genus and their species, which again we'll talk more about. But notice early beliefs were very biblical in their basis. Next was I'm gonna butcher his name, but it's George Cuvier. I know I butchered that so badly, but he is known for catastrophism. So he said that changes in the Earth's crust and geology have caused sudden and violent changes in events, which have led to changes in species. James Hutton was a geologist who offered an alternative to this, and he actually said the opposite. He said that Earth has changed gradually, that changes in the Earth's crust have been due to slow, continuous processes like erosion and earthquakes and volcanoes, and therefore profound changes are due to slow but continuous processes over time. Thomas Malthus, he was really the closest to what Darwin came up with, and he said that plants and animals are capable of producing far more offspring than there are resources. So there's less food and living space and mates for everyone to survive, and thus there's a struggle for existence that exists. There's some sort of competition between living things. And Charles Lyell, he came up with uniformitarianism. And he said that changes in the Earth's crust have resulted from continuous and uniform processes. So also going against what Cuvier said. He was also unique because he was the first to propose that Earth was millions of years old rather than just a few thousand years old. And then Jean-Baptiste Lamarck believed that species evolved by use and disuse. So he said they keep adaptations that they use and they lose adaptations that they don't use. And he believed in the inheritance of acquired traits. So he said giraffes grew long necks because in their lifetime they would stretch their necks and then they would pass on a slightly longer neck to their children, and then their children would stretch their necks more and pass on an even slightly longer neck to their children, and so forth. But we know now that we know genetics, this isn't true, that traits you acquire in your lifetime, like dyeing your hair pink and going to CrossFit to get a 12-pack, don't get passed on to your children. Someone with pink hair and a 12-pack from CrossFit don't have babies with pink hair and 12-packs from CrossFit because they don't pass on acquired traits. But again, Lamarck's ideas sound silly now because we know about genetics, but without knowing about genetics, they may have made sense to a lot of people. He also said that organisms have a tendency towards perfection, that things change in order to be perfect for their environment. And then there's Darwin. And so I wanted to give you all that context so that you can see that Darwin did not come up with evolution. Evolution had been around for years before him. He was just the first to really have a mechanism to explain how evolution occurred. And he was an English naturalist. He loved to study nature. And he went on a voyage around around the world, but did a lot of studies in the Galapagos Islands. And he observed adaptations of the plants and animals that lived there and the diverse environments on the different islands. So he looked at finches and he looked at tortoises and beetles and all sorts of things. What he saw was that these different species lived on different islands and had specific characteristics for that island. So finches on one island had different beaks and adaptations to that specific environment than finches on a different island. And so from this, he developed his theory of natural selection. So here are his overall observations. Left unchecked, the number of organisms of each species is always going to increase. In nature, though, populations tend to remain stable in size. They're not always increasing. And they're remaining stable because environmental resources are limited. Individuals of a population vary in characteristics, so no two individuals are exactly alike. And a lot of this variation is heritable. It's actually in their genes that makes them different. And this led him to natural selection, which says that some organisms will survive and reproduce better than others, causing changes in the population over time by acting on traits that are heritable. So again, only traits that are in your genes. And it basically sums up as survival of the fittest. And fit means how well you can survive in your specific environment. So if you're the most fit, you have the best traits that allow you to survive the best in your environment. And he came up with natural selection based on some conclusions. And these conclusions align with his four main principles of natural selection. So here they are. First, that variation exists in every population, which may have been inherited, or it could be the result of a mutation. So you're either getting it from your parents or you're getting it from a mutation. Second, he said the production of more individuals, which is the overproduction of offspring. There are more individuals being produced than can be supported by an environment, and this leads to a struggle for existence. So he's quoting Malthus there. Among individuals. So there's too many individuals for the actual resources in the environment. So not everyone's going to be able to survive. Adaptation was third. He said that individuals who inherit characteristics, which are adaptations, that are most fit, so most suitable and favorable for their environment, are likely to leave more offspring than those that are less fit. So if you have traits that make you better at surviving, you will live longer, and thus you're able to reproduce more. Thus, your genes should be getting passed on more. Thus, those traits, those adaptations you have, should be becoming more common. And he called this fitness, the amount of adaptations you had that are suitable and favorable, again, to your specific environment. High survival equals more offspring, which means you're more fit. Low survival, less offspring, less fit. And then last was descent with modification. So over time, these adaptations, these traits that help you survive, should increase in the population. I'm going to go through each of these really briefly, just a little bit more in detail. So variations are differences in physical traits, and the source of them is really important. They come from random mutations, genetic recombination during meiosis, which we know is crossing over during prophase 1, and migration, which is specifically called gene flow, because migration doesn't matter unless you actually reproduce with another organism. But random mutations are the ultimate source because asexual reproducers don't do meiosis and migration wouldn't affect them. So this is the ultimate source because it affects asexual and sexual reproducers alike. Overproduction of offspring, simplifying that, it just means there's more offspring than there are limited resources, and that's creating competition for those resources. And due to variation, some organisms then are better than others. Adaptations are actual features that make you better at surviving in your environment. So it's not a process, it's not a verb, it is a noun. It's a trait that you have. And not all traits you have are adaptations, only the ones that make you better in your environment. And the best adaptations should become more common over time because organisms should be living longer and reproducing more and passing on their genes more. And this would change the gene pool. And the gene pool is all the genes or all these alleles, the versions of those genes of all individuals in a population. And so what we should see is, let's say some ducks in a pond have yellow fur and some have brown fur. I don't even know if they have fur. I guess it's feathers. Okay, some ducks have yellow feathers and some have brown feathers. So let's say having yellow feathers allows you to survive and reproduce in your environment. Well, that doesn't make sense. Let's say the brown feathers allow you to blend in with your environment more, thus you're not seen by predators. So you're able to live longer and reproduce more than ducks with yellow feathers. So what we should see in the gene pool is that there's alleles for yellow and there's alleles for brown feathers. But over time, as these organisms with the brown feathers are reproducing more, their alleles should become more common in the gene pool, and so it should become a more common trait. Descent with modification is just saying that changes in gene frequencies, how common genes are in that gene pool, can happen over time. And natural selection leads to populations with new phenotypes adapted to new situations. And those traits, these phenotypes, are coming from ancestors. We're descending from ancestors, but we're modified. And again, we should see that beneficial traits for our survival should become more common over time. Now we see three kind of modes of natural selection, three main modes. So the dotted line is showing before, and the blue line is showing after. This first mode is directional selection. This is increasing the expression of an extreme version of a trait in a population. So this is just when we're basically favoring one extreme or another of a population, not the average, not the middle. So for example, most of moths have light-colored wings, but dark moths start to appear. Because moths live against tree barks, years later most of the moths were dark. Thus, more dark moths survived, adding more genes for dark color to the population. So selection went from favoring one extreme maybe to another in directional selection. Alright, disruptive selection is where the process splits the population into two groups. It's favoring both extremes, and the average is not favored. And this could create such two populations, groups that are so different, they actually become different species. So again, before we're favoring the average, after we're favoring the two extremes. So let's say snakes live on rocks and are gray. Hold on one second. All right, there we go. Just kind of want to move this over a little bit. It was kind of in my way. So let's say snakes live on rocks and are gray, and that are gray will survive. Snakes that live on grass and are green will survive. But any snakes that are in the middle, that are green and gray, those would be disadvantaged because they would be more visible in both environments. Alright, stabilizing selection actually eliminates the extremes, and it's going to favor the middle. It's going to favor the average. And so this is like human babies. So babies that are too small and babies that are too big have lower chances of survival than babies that are average weight, around 7.5 pounds. Because the too small babies are more susceptible to disease, and the too large babies have a hard time being birthed through the birth canal. And so a medium birth weight is favored. Alright, let's talk about these allele frequencies. Each allele has a frequency, which means just how common it is in a population's gene pool. So it's just the number of times it's appearing in a population. The greater the frequency, the greater the allele is, so the more common it is. And it's showing how frequently the allele, so maybe a dominant allele or recessive allele, appears in the gene pool. Remember, gene pool is all the alleles of individuals in a population. And we can calculate these frequencies. So if there's only two versions of an allele in a population, dominant and recessive, we represent the frequency, how common the dominant allele is, with the letter P, and how common the recessive allele is with a Q. And if there's only two versions of a gene, what we should see is that P plus Q should equal 1. So the frequency, the decimal of P in the population plus the decimal of Q should always equal 1. Or the percent of P plus the percent of Q should always equal 100%. That's what we should see. And so we can use this equation. If we know how common one is, we can determine the other. So let's do an example mathematically. Let's say in a population of wildflowers, red is dominant to white. And let's say in 500 total plants in the population, 20 are white, so they'd be little a. 320 are homozygous red, big A, and 160 flowers are heterozygous, they're big A, little a. How many total alleles for flower color are there in this population? First, well, there's 500 total plants, and each plant gets 2 alleles for a trait, one from mom, one from dad. So there's 1,000 total alleles. Now, if we want to know how many of those alleles are dominant or recessive, we can do that. So there's 1,000 total, 500 plants with 2 alleles each. So let's say we want to figure out how many little a alleles there are. Well, there's 20 coming from the dads of the white plants, 20 coming from the dads or the moms of the white plants, and 160 coming in from one of the parents of these heterozygous individuals, which is 200 alleles. Now, that means all the rest must be dominant, which would be 800. But we can do the math on that also. 320 come from one parent from homozygous dominant, 320 come from the other parent, and then 160 come from the heterozygous, and that gives us those 800 alleles. Then we can figure out, okay, well, how common is the dominant allele versus the recessive? We can find the frequency of A and the frequency of little a by finding P and Q. And when we're talking about frequency, we're just using a decimal. If we say percent, we're just turning that decimal into percent. So all we would do is do part over whole. So there's 800 total dominant alleles over 1,000 total alleles, and that gives us P, which is 0.8. And there are 200 recessive alleles divided by 1,000 total alleles, which gives us Q, which is 0.2. And then you'll notice we can check P plus Q is supposed to equal 1, and 0.8 plus 0.2 equals 1. Check, we did it right. So how do allele frequencies change and give us genetic variation? So what does this math even have to do with everything? Remember, microevolution is evolution on a small scale affecting just one population. And we kind of have 3 mechanisms that will cause this microevolution and this change in allele frequencies like we just calculated. So first let's talk through genetic drift. Genetic drift is random change in the frequency of alleles of a population over time. Rare alleles in a population will decrease in frequency, other alleles will increase in frequency. And these changes may be more obvious in small populations. So for example, let's look at this population of flowers. 80% of them are red and 20% are white. Let's say randomly, only these 3 randomly just get to reproduce. So in the next population, 30% end up being white and 70% end up being red. And then let's say in this population, only these 3 randomly get to reproduce. Then all of a sudden we have a population that's completely red. That's genetic drift. It's just random change that will cause this change in frequency over time. And it's going to have a bigger effect in small populations like this. Gene flow is just the movement of genes into or out of a population. And it occurs during migration when organisms migrate in and then reproduce with the organisms that are there. And it usually increases genetic variation. So let's say we have an island of yellow beetles and an island of blue beetles. If one of these blue beetles migrates over on a duck to this island, and it reproduces with these, it's now introduced new genes for blue. And we see some variation, and we can see some evolution occur of this species this population of beetles. Now, this is microevolution because it's only affecting this population, not all beetles in the entire world. And so that's really important to remember. And then the third mechanism is sexual selection, or non-random mating, or artificial selection. And so this is where sex determines what traits are valuable, not nature and the environment. And this is where we favor traits that may actually not help your survival, but without them you can't reproduce. And peacocks are the perfect example of this. Male peacocks have these outrageous colors and these really long, beautiful feathers with these beautiful eyes in them. And that is what allows them to attract mates and be able to reproduce. But it actually doesn't help them to survive because they stand out more to predators. But it's still become a trait that has become popular and evolved because they can't reproduce without it. And there's a really cool video about this in the notes section of this PowerPoint, if you have the physical PowerPoint, that I suggest you pause and watch, that kind of explains the experiments that went behind proving this, which is pretty cool. So, genetic equilibrium is when there would be no changes in the allele frequencies in a population. So, allele frequencies are constant. And there's math that backs this up that we're going to learn called the Hardy-Weinberg principle or Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. But before we get to the math, there's 5 conditions that must be met in order for a population to be in genetic equilibrium where evolution is not occurring. And these are the 5 conditions. First, the population has to be large in order to negate any effects of genetic drift. Second, there can be no migration in order to negate any effects of gene flow. Third, there has to be random mating in order to negate any effects of sexual selection. Fourth, there can be no mutations because we know that mutations are the ultimate source of genetic variation. And genetic variation can lead to natural selection. And then, of course, there can be no natural selections. The environment can't favor certain traits for survival over others. Now, Hardy-Weinberg Equilibrium, HWE. We already know that in all populations with only 2 possible alleles for a gene, P plus Q equals 1. This can allow us to calculate the allele frequencies for dominant allele P and recessive allele Q. We know that. But when a population is in Hardy-Weinberg, we can also add an additional equation that will allow us to calculate the frequency of genotypes. So how popular is homozygous recessive versus heterozygous? And that equation is P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared equals 1. And you do need to memorize both of these equations. They will not be given to you. Okay, P squared is the genotypic frequency of the homozygous dominant individuals. 2PQ is the genotypic frequency, so how common heterozygous is. And then Q squared represents homozygous recessive. So each of these are your 3 options, and that's why they have to equal 1. So let's do an example. Let's say round heads are dominant to cone heads, and 51% of individuals in a population have round heads. What portion of this 51% are homozygous if the population is in Hardy-Weinberg? So because it says in Hardy-Weinberg, we can use this second equation. If it doesn't say that, we can't use it, and we'll do an example of that later. So 51% means 0.51 of the population, that would be the frequency of this percent, is either big R or big R little r. So we can't really do anything with that because basically 0.51 equals P squared plus 2PQ. That's 2 unknowns that we don't know. But we do know that P plus Q equals 1. So that means that 49% of the population, 0.49, has the cone head, and their genotype must be little r. So 0.49 we can set equal to Q squared. Then we can take the square root of that and determine that Q equals 0.7. And that means that P has to equal 0.3 because P plus Q equals 1. Then, to know how much of the population is homozygous, we just find P squared, which would be 0.3 squared, which is 0.09. Or if we ask for a percentage, you can say 9% of the population would be big R. All right, then there are some practice problems embedded in here. All of the answers are in here. So if you want to read through this and pause, you can, and then you'll find all of the answers as I click through. So I'm not going to go through and explain each of these because if you're in my class, I really want you to come to tutoring to make sure you're getting help on what you missed. But I do want you to pause and try these before looking at all of the answers to make sure you know how to do them. This last one especially, pay close attention. You cannot assume Hardy-Weinberg, so you can't use this equation. So we're going to do some different things in order to figure it out. But I do want you to try it on your own first. All right, and that's concept 1. And I know this math can be really complicated, so please make sure you're coming in for tutoring if you weren't here in class to learn this to get help, especially on this math.